All right, so we are recording, and there was a question kind of if a person over tallied, what did they miss or whatnot? The 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 biggest thing you
No.
sorry, I'm had to mute that person. The biggest thing you missed was uh, the syllabus review, as well as the first half of lecture one. We're still in the middle of lecture one, but we should be able to finish by the end of today. So let me share my screen. This is where we left off. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. I always like to ask so that I know that everybody's on the same page. So we started with some basic concepts like, well, why the history of psychology, why study it? We made some reference to the fact that psychology is somewhat unique in this regard, that it has a course on its history, and it actually has had a course on its history for quite some time. We also talked about history as being incomplete. So we don't always have access to all of the information about a person. It sometimes becomes available at a later point or is found at a later point in the case of lost documents. We also have to be mindful that many people have a self-serving bias. So in their autobiographies and in some biographies, people and their life narrative is exaggerated a little bit more favorably than perhaps true. And the two examples that we talked about at the end of last class were Freud and Skinner. So Skinner overstated his work ethic, and Freud emphasized more of having to fight for his ideas to be accepted than was reality. At the time that Freud passed away, his ideas were at the top of the field, and many of the clinical programs, certainly on the Northeast, were shaped by them. Now, we also have to acknowledge that when history happens, it doesn't just happen in a vacuum. Usually the actions that occur are a function of what's happening in the world around us. So, for example, if we were to go back to 2020 and think about the belated cultural awakening we had after George Floyd's death, right? Well, that insight, that awareness should have occurred much earlier than that. But that experience and the tensions of the day created more dialogue than in previous years, which is, I'm glad that we're having the dialogue, right? But it's a little bit late. But the social climate plays a role in history. So we refer to the zeitgeist, which is the intellectual or cultural spirit of the time. You probably have seen the second half of this word geist as in spirit, such as a poltergeist, but a zeitgeist is the spirit of the times, right? Whether it be intellectual or cultural. And it includes things like economic opportunity, war, prejudice. The other thing that's not on the slide, which I want to introduce as a word, is the Ortgeist. So just like the time matters, the experience happening in a certain time period matters, the location matters. So Ortgeist refers to location. So everything in history, everything in psychology is impacted by time and place, right? So we need to be mindful of that. So let's look at some of these elements of the zeitgeist and how they impacted our discipline. right? So if we were to look at the turn of this century, not 2000, but 1900, we had more PhDs granted in psychology than there were academic positions. What does that mean? People with degrees that were not useful or they could not monetize. And because there are only so many faculty positions, psychology had to adapt itself. And then all of a sudden, you start to see in the early 1900s a big boom in applied psychology. Things like the application of psychology to education, which was one of the first places we applied it to, because as a function of the Industrial Revolution, people moved from small towns to bigger cities, and they started to establish larger structures of schools, right? So it was no longer these small schoolhouses. There were larger school networks or systems. And when kids were entering school, they needed to determine where to place them in terms of their capabilities. So we talk about tracking and placement and things like that. Well, psychologists capitalized on that, as we'll hear later in the semester, and developed a whole host of psychological tests, achievement tests, IQ tests. You might have heard of Binet, right? So Alfred Binet was hired by the French ministry at the same time period to develop an assessment that would screen kids that could profit from regular ed versus special ed. And that became the Stanford Binet IQ test. So education was a big place that we started to focus. We also applied things to, let's say, industry, business. So you start to see industrial organizational psychology come out. And then you start to see the application of psychology to the military system. And to this day, the Veteran Affairs Department is the #1 hiring source for psychologists, because there are VAs in every local community, and people who have experienced war sometimes come back with psychological distress, and they need to have a resource for them. So since the 1940s, we adapted our work to real world problems. So I keep going on to this. So we pay attention to the fact that we need to be able to use our degrees. And if we can't use our degrees, then the field is going to die out pretty quickly. We also, I talked to you about the boom in the American population and public education. So that I mentioned the testing movement, and then pragmatism. The American pragmatism is our spirit. And I know I asked the question last class, who's the founding father of psychology? And the answer in virtually every textbook is Wilhelm Wundt, because he established the first psych laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, right? However, when we think about it, the American pragmatism, that spirit came from people like William James. So instead of thinking about structure, he focused on function, and he was very much practical in his use of psychology. Things like forensic psychology, right? That is a very practical application of psychology as well. So these elements, then the change of the American experience in the 1900s, the education system, and William James's push to make psychology functional, not as theoretical, all led to psychology booming. Now, I talked a little bit about this as well. War is another force or contextual force that plays a role. Psychologists were hired to develop psychological tests to establish whether or not a prospective soldier was competent. So Yerkes created the Army Alpha and Beta tests, which were screening tools for the Army to determine whether or not to take a given person. One of the problems with Yerkes Army Alpha and Beta tests was they were a lot easier to fake. So you could fake as if you were incompetent to avoid combat situations, things like that. But that, we've gotten better at creating malingering scales when a person's faking. The MMPI includes items that determine whether you're faking to be better than you are and also faking to be worse than you are. So we have better tools today than the Army Alpha and Beta test. Now, between World War I and World War II, Europe was in a very tense state. As you may recall, after World War I, Germany was treated as the country that was responsible for World War I, and therefore was required to pay reparations in the amount of billions of dollars. So Germany's economy in the 1920s tanked. And it didn't help that at the end of the 1920s, we had the stock market crash, where America was a lending source for Germany, but when our market crashed, we stopped lending to Germany. So they went into this state of what's called hyperinflation, where their dollar just became absolutely useless. Now, what that created, though, was space for the Nazis, right? So Hitler becomes very prominent and starts to say, hey, look at Germany. Germany is no longer what it used to be. And he promised to bring Germany back to its previous financial state of independence and rid Germany of any individual that was considered inferior or problematic. So Hitler gets on the ballot, ultimately becomes chancellor, and from 1933 till 1938 establishes a whole bunch of Nuremberg laws, which made it very uncomfortable in Germany and many other fascist countries for Jewish psychologists. So they started to flee. So you start to see a lot of European psychologists who were Jewish fled to England, such as Sigmund Freud. He wound up in England as the war was breaking out. And a lot of people from Europe wound up in America. So that is how America became the primary voice of psychology. Because if you think about it, Germany was the largest, strongest voice of psychology, because we had people like Helmholtz, we had people like Wundt, and we had people like Weber, and so many other brilliant German minds. But when there was a mass exodus of intellectual talent, America became the place and the primary voice of psychology. So then World War II obviously breaks out, 1938, 1939, and America tries to remain neutral. And in fact, FDR tried to stay neutral to the point where he did not support either side financially, and he didn't distinguish between the aggressor and the victim until Pearl Harbor in 1941. Then America is pulled into the war, and we send soldiers over to Europe, and they did not come back the same, right? So as I said, since World War II, the VA is the number one hiring source for psychologists. It's because people develop post-traumatic stress disorder. People develop sense of worthlessness. It wasn't like today where if you went and fought, there are laws to protect you and your job. People came back and they didn't have a job. They came back and they were viewed very negatively for being part of the war. And then clinical psychologists came out to kind of help process these things. Now, industrial and organizational psychology, that is another booming field. It starts before World War II, but during World War II, as I said, trying to get the right people to do a given job was important. So you start to see psychologists get into personnel selection, how to hire the right candidate. And that should sound familiar, right? Because even today, we have the same issue with making sure we hire the right candidate. And psychologists have a lot to say about that. And there are instruments you can give to determine that. And that comes as a function of World War II. And then things like engineering and human factors, that's the HR side of industrial organizational psychology. Now, that is one aspect of history, but if I were to tell you that the field of psychology didn't have problems from its onset, that would be a lie. If we look historically, there were a lot of individuals who were excluded from the discipline, or their life was made more uncomfortable just by virtue of their gender, religion, or their race. And I'll give you a couple examples, but we'll go into greater detail as we move along. But let's just take a look at discrimination against women. So there were many schools that refused to even admit women to grad school. So you start to see that women either have to go to what's called the sister school, which we'll talk about later, and do their degree at an all women's version of the college, or they were basically treated as if they weren't part of the student body. And people like Eleanor Gibson wasn't admitted to Yale, right? Only because she was female. And give you another example, Gordon Allport. Many of you've heard of Gordon Allport. Gordon Allport was a leading figure in personality theory. However, here's what Sandra Scar was told. Gordon Allport said, 75% of you get married, have kids, and never finish your degree. And the rest of you never amount to anything. If that wasn't explicit sexism, I don't know what was, right? The irony is that if we look at the leading voices of psychology today, the vast majority are actually female. And that tells a story. When you promote inclusion and opportunity, people start to take that opportunity and demonstrate their capabilities. 7 out of every 10 doctoral degrees that are issued are female today. So it's clear that Gordon Allport got it wrong. And today we would refer to this as sexist. But again, what was the zeitgeist? When you think about the late 1800s and early 1900s, think about that and how women were viewed. If you look in commercials, women were viewed typically as housewives, and that was their role. And that eventually was broken away from, but Gordon Allport's statement is just another example of that mindset. Now, Cattell was the first person to really not buy into like this whole male superiority myth. And he said no in terms of the exclusion of women. So give you an example, he nominated 2 females to be part of the American Psychological Association. Now, the American Psychological Association has a long history, and it's not always a good history. But to its credit, the American Psychological Association was the first professional association, guild association, to accept women. Well before the American Law Association and many others. Now, in terms of president of the association, Mary Whiton Calkins becomes the first female president of the American Psychological Association in 1905. But don't let that fool you, because if you look at the history of presidents of the American Psychological Association, until more recently, they were largely white males. So this, even though we mentioned, hey, Mary Whiton Calkins became the first president of the APA, that doesn't mean the conditions were all that progressive at the time. Now, in terms of religion, Jews were exposed to tremendous anti-Semitism. When you think about it, even into the 1960s, when the civil rights movement is in full force, Jews faced admission quotas in college and grad school. And there were some colleges that had a 0% quota. They refused to allow any Jews in their school, which is sad. And I think I mentioned last class about Thorndike, Edward Thorndike, as being at Columbia University. And he was hired in part to develop a test that would disadvantage Jews from being admitted, and it significantly dropped Jewish admissions to Columbia University. And then other universities like Johns Hopkins and Clark University, maybe they didn't say you couldn't go to the school, but there wasn't a job waiting for you afterwards. So Johns Hopkins, Clark, they had a policy not to even hire Jewish professors as faculty. So what do? People are pragmatic, and people start to change their name. So David Krech changed his name, and Maslow, Abraham Maslow, which we all know the name, he was advised to do the same in order to have a career. Maslow did not in the end. He kept his name, and he happened to do okay because he was in the Northeast. He did manage to get an academic career. But so if academia is not a place that's welcoming to Jews, then you're like, well, what am I going to do with my degree? Well, for that reason, many Jews went into clinical psychology so that they could be their own boss. They could do therapy, and nobody could hire or fire them, or they didn't have to worry about hiring and firing based on their religion. Either a person's going to come to you knowing you're Jewish or they're not. But once they come to you, you didn't have to worry about being fired just because of your faith. And there are a lot of faculty at that time that were fired for keeping religious holidays, something that sounds absurd today. So in any event, if you are wondering why there's a disproportionate number of Jews in the applied psychology or clinical psychology realm, it's because many universities would not hire them. So again, discrimination in admission policies, discrimination in hiring practices, all of these things that are going on during the Civil Rights Act, right? So civil rights movement, I should say. And if you look, 1964, 1965, 1968, there's a whole bunch of civil rights acts that would prohibit these very practices. So, but it's not that long ago that there was this problem. And then the same thing for racial discrimination. So African Americans faced significant prejudice from psychology. So many African Americans were not allowed entry into the university, similar to what we've heard in a larger society. The psychology departments were no different. Now, if you were to look, Francis Sumner was the first Black person to become a PhD in psychology. And it's interesting because his history was that they separated the dining hall, and very few people actually would eat with him. So, his greatness occurred in spite of all of that negative energy. And then Howard University becomes what is referred to in many communities as the Black Harvard. And they became the primary institution granting university for African Americans. Now, one more husband-wife team that I'll mention, Kenneth and Mamie Clark. You probably have heard of them because they were part of the testimony for Brown versus the Board of Education, and they provided the research on the white dolls versus the Black dolls, and how there was an internalized negative attitude towards being Black because society was pushing, you're inferior, we don't want you, things like that. So both white and Black children preferred or chose the white doll. And that was pretty telling. And ultimately, they did manage to be convincing, and Brown versus Board of Ed did desegregate the schools in the 1950s. So that was a big thing, but there are two psychologists who experienced their own prejudice trying to get this moving. So when we talk about it, I want you to start to see psychology as kind of, there's a lot going on there, and not all of it is great, but you have to know the good and the bad of psychology. Now, if we were to think about our discipline, there are two different mindsets as to how changes in scientific psychology occurs. So there's the personalistic theory, which suggests that changes in scientific history occurs due to unique people. You might hear that referred to as the great person approach. And then there's a competing theory that no, society has to be ready for it. So a naturalistic theory suggests that changes in our understanding occurs due to the zeitgeist. And it isn't about that one person. You could have another person present these ideas. If the environment is unwelcoming, the idea is not going to be accepted. If the environment is welcoming, then that's how you get change. So the environment plays a role as to how the field progresses. So if we were to think of a personalistic theory, we might think of people like Charles Darwin, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr. These are all, none of these people do I need to tell you who they were, right? Because you all know. And their accomplishments are profound. So a personalistic theory would say there's only one Darwin. There's no other Darwin. No, if Darwin didn't produce these ideas, then the theory of evolution would not be what it is today. Abraham Lincoln. Without Lincoln, we would not have the reunification of a nation post Civil War, and we wouldn't have the freeing of slaves. And then Martin Luther King and all of the civil rights acts that occurred, we wouldn't have without Dr. King. So this mindset is that it had to be this person. The problem with this mindset is that there were other people competing and doing this very thing. So when you think of Charles Darwin as the founding father of the theory of evolution, Darwin wasn't the only person who came up with the theory of evolution. People like, I'll go back to Greek philosophy, Anaximander has the first theory of evolution. You have Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, and many others. Lincoln, he wasn't the only abolitionist, right? So, and it goes on and on. You get what I'm trying to say. So, in a personalistic theory, they suggest that great person is necessary for that change to occur. Without them, that change would not occur. So, in other words, people make the times, not the time make the people. So it's a problematic theory. So people criticize this and say, hey, wait a minute. There are a lot of times where ideas were either ignored or suppressed, or intellectual ideas were unwelcome by virtue of identity, right? So things are not in a meritocracy. So yes, Jordan, I tend to lecture to the end if you're wondering. So stick around, buddy. All right. So that's a personalistic theory. From a naturalistic point of view, if we were to talk about nature, now this argument believes that the times makes the person. So the time period and the attitudes of that time period, they're either going to be accepted or not accepted based on where society is. So if you were to think about someone like Charles Darwin, imagine Charles Darwin trying to present the theory of evolution in the 1500s. He would be viewed as a heretic and likely killed. Now, even in the 1800s, when he did present this, he worried about the fallout. So we have to be mindful that the environment also has to be open to ideas. So this theory suggests that even if that great person were to pass away, the idea would have still occurred. So if Darwin didn't write Origin of the Species, it would have come from another point of view. So I'm going to ask you, all right, which one do you think is more correct? So let me pick a person. Ayman, which one do you think is more correct? Ayman,
Yes, Professor.
which position do you think is more correct?
Can you repeat the question one more time, please?
Or which position do you think is more correct, a personalistic or naturalistic theory, and why?
I think, in my opinion, I would probably choose a naturalistic theory, just because it just makes a bit more sense to me.
Okay, can you explain how it makes more sense?
From my understanding, it's that it's more focused on ideas, I suppose, as opposed to the person.
Okay, but it's actually more, it's not the person or the idea, it's the idea in a given cultural environment. That's really what the naturalistic theory is.
Mm.
Alexis, how about you? What do you think?
I'm sorry, I literally stepped away from my computer to use the bathroom, so I missed this last part.
So we were talking about a personalistic versus a naturalistic theory. A personalistic theory is also referred to as the great person or the great thinker approach, which suggests that there's only one person who would have been able to come up with this idea. So there's only one Einstein. So his theory of relativity would not have existed without him. Darwin's theory of evolution would not have existed without him. So that's the personalistic point of view. The naturalistic theory suggests that no, it's not about the person, it's about the environment and whether the environment is ready for that idea. So they're going to either accept it or not. So now that I've caught you up, which one do you take?
Thank you for catching me up. Personally, I feel like the personalistic only because
Right?
I feel like those individuals specifically caught attention towards these ideas, and it took them to build upon it and like do more research as opposed to just the idea coming about.
So if Charles Darwin didn't exist, then the theory of evolution would not exist. That's the position?
Yeah, like if he didn't really sit there and believe that evolution was true, like he wouldn't have like further done his like research for it. I feel like the idea of evolution wouldn't just appear in somebody else's head.
Well, the tricky thing, I picked that one in particular because the discussions about evolution, you'll hear them from Anaximander in Greek philosophy, or Erasmus Darwin 2 generations before him, or even Alfred Wallace, which was a contemporary. So it's tricky. It's tricky. And where we land today is you need the person and the environment. It's not one is more true than the other. We have evidence to support both positions, and we have evidence to challenge both positions, if that makes sense. So today, you'll start to see that I sometimes ask questions for critical thinking where there's no objective right or wrong answer. So if you take personalistic, you have an argument to support you. If you take naturalistic, you have an argument to support you. But I want you to think about why you are taking your position. And that's all. So, because otherwise, I could do this lecture in 50 minutes, an hour, fly right through it. But I want us to start to consolidate some of these ideas. All right. So, Wilhelm Wundt, right? Gabrielle, go ahead.
I mean, I agree that it is both viewpoints, like at the end of the day. Like if you take a general day to day, when you take a person, it's what's in them versus what's out of them and how they bounce off each other. Yeah, but in the context of if there's a whole person that didn't come up with this, would this never be around again? I have to say I disagree. I think the environment would create another genius. I think another one would be born because at the end of the day, the world needs what it needs and the times need what it's need. And if it's true, it will come out. So it's, I feel like in an extreme cases such as if you have a genius, will those concepts be forever lost? I think even if it takes another 100 years, just as history repeats itself, that should also repeat itself. I don't know if that's like relevant though.
No, it's a good argument. I like your thoughtfulness, and I'm because I like the discussion. I'll push back a little bit with someone like Shakespeare. Shakespeare introduced something like 500 new words to the English dictionary. Language is novel, we know that, right? So in that case, if there was no Shakespeare, would those words have been created? So that's an example where maybe Shakespeare is that person that creates this. So there's an argument on both sides, to be honest with you. And I saw Chloe, I think you had your hand up and then pulled it down.
Yeah, I was just gonna say basically the same thing as Gabrielle. I was just gonna say how even if one person doesn't create something, there are other people who can. It may not be at the same time, it could be in the future, but eventually someone will have come up with those ideas. It may not be the same, it may be different in some cases, but yeah, like if one person doesn't come up with something or create something or come up with these ideas, then someone else will eventually.
Yeah. And there, for example, I'll give you support for your argument, the telephone. It is argued that there are 3 people who have legitimate claims to the creation of the telephone. And we give credit to Alexander Graham Bell, but that's only due to a court case. Alexander Graham Bell was sued for patent infringement because there was someone else who kept a provisional patent going, and then ultimately they couldn't pay for it because they weren't so wealthy, and then they lost their patent, and then Bell took it and went with it. So that's a good example of multiple people having, and it wasn't that Bell just took it. Bell had his own ideas about how it should work too. But there are 3 people, roughly the same time period, who could have been credited with the development of the telephone. So that would be a very good example of if the environment is ready for this idea, you don't need a specific person. Now, there are people who their ideas were so controversial, so different than the prevailing societal views. And these individuals, you have more of an argument that, hey, if they didn't push against it, then maybe we would think that the world is still flat. Things like that. I don't know. But anyway, I love the discussion. Anyone else have a thought or reaction that they want to weigh in?
Yeah, I just wanted to
Professor?
say,
All right, so we have 2. So go for it, Jenna, first.
I was gonna say, I guess kind of it depends on kind of what you said. It depends on both. Because I feel like, yes, more people are gonna come around with the same ideas, but if the times aren't right, like that's why those people succeeded, because like you said before, there were people before who had the same ideas, but the times weren't right. So I think it's a mix of both.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, someone else was going to chime in, but I didn't catch because 2 people were at the same time.
yeah, I was just
Yeah.
gonna say that it started making sense when you said that they go hand in hand, because obviously, for me at least, I've learned over the years how an environment can have an impact on the people that are there. So they definitely do go hand in hand.
But we're not going to resolve the debate 100% because it's a philosophical debate. There are people who take either position. For my class, I just want you to know the 2 positions, and as it relates to the 2 positions, what the implication of those positions are. We don't have to resolve the debate tonight. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So now let's get to a sense of what psychology is, right? So Wilhelm Wundt is viewed as the founding father of psychology. And what makes him the founder is, and I put it in all caps, not because I want to scream at you, but there is a difference between being a founder of an idea and an originator of an idea, right? So Wundt did not come up with these ideas and be the first person who came up with them. what Wundt did that was really incredible was he took and synthesized the philosophy of consciousness with scientific methods, right? So the ability to move psychology from the speculative to the more empirical is what he did that turned psychology into what it is. And even today, we're influenced by Wilhelm Wundt. Now, the concept of structuralism as a school of thought is gone, right? So his school of thought as we know it is gone, but it doesn't mean that psychology wasn't shaped by his vision. So the emphasis on research and data to formulate hypotheses, we owe that to Wundt. Wundt was strong on data collection and evidence. So that's one of his gifts, so to speak. In addition, we'll learn in lecture 4, when we talk about him, we'll learn that not only did he do the studies, but he created the lab, and our understanding of lab sciences are shaped by him. He founded the first, actually, that's not true. It's not the first, but he founded a psychology journal, and he wrote extensively about psychology to the point that the contemporaries would go to Germany to learn under him. So psychology was really influenced by Wundt. Now, ultimately, we live in a time period where there's no singular point of view that is true. Now, from a philosophy point of view, a school of thought is called a paradigm, right? A paradigm is a school of thought, a set of assumptions that people agree on. But psychology isn't in the paradigmatic stage. Actually, we're pre-paradigmatic, pre meaning before paradigm. And what does that mean? It means that psychologists continue to argue and have significant different points of view on different areas of the discipline. But it does help when you have a group of people who are able to articulate their point of view. So the school of thought concept is you have a group of people who share an identity in psychology. For example, you might have heard of the behaviorist. Well, the behaviorists, they have a shared identity in terms of empirical data, environmental triggers result in behavioral responses. There are certain assumptions that behaviorists share or make. But if you put a behaviorist in a room with a psychoanalyst who suggests that there are things that don't have a clear overt trigger, but things are happening on an unconscious level, they don't agree on the same point, right? So the behaviorists would argue with the psychoanalyst and vice versa as to what motivates behavior. All right. So Thomas Kuhn talked about science being in 3 phases. The pre-paradigmatic stage, which is where we are today, is when we're divided into different schools of thought. The humanistic existential psychologists differ with the psychoanalytic psychologists, which differ with the Gestalt psychologists, which differ from the behavioral psychologists. There are all these different points of view. Now, what I will tell you, and it's not a plug for my other class, neuroscience is kind of closing the gap between points of view. Because when we look in the brain, we're able to reconcile a lot of these differences. So it's cool now that neuroscience has evolved to a certain point that some of the silly arguments we once had, we don't maintain. I'll give you one example. As part of this understanding of different points of view, different schools of thought, let's take a look at language. There are two diametrically opposed points of view. And they're not the only two theories of language, but if we were to look at Skinner's argument as to how people learn a language and compare it to Noam Chomsky, they're very different. So Skinner says, well, we learn language through experience and modeling and reinforcement, all of those operant conditioning principles that you would expect him to say. The only problem is that according to research, if you wanted to acquire a language that way, you would need a parent, caregiver, or teacher to be working with you for the first 6 years of life, 24/7, constantly teaching, constantly reinforcing. And that's not what happens, right? There's a lot of downtime in the first 6 years of life where people are passively learning. So it can't all be due to reinforcement and modeling and all of these things. Well, Noam Chomsky, on the other hand, talks about this concept called the language acquisitional device, which basically suggests that there's a part of the mind that's responsible for language acquisition, and only the human animal, only human beings have it. So we are unique and distinctly capable of acquiring language, and we're wired naturally with this. It's not about reinforcement. It's either you're wired with the capability of acquiring language or not. So it's the nature nurture argument. Skinner says nurture, Chomsky says nature, and then neuroscience comes in and says, hey, wait a minute, I found Broca's area, I found Wernicke's area, and I have wiring in the neurons that says, hey, there is this sense of brain tissue that either you have this or you don't. So Chomsky, you have a good point. However, we also know that when people are deprived of enrichment, so we talk about Jeannie, the child that wasn't taught language, that environmental deprivation does have significant impact. So it's a combination of the two. So that's how neuroscience can answer some debates. Anyway, on a larger sense, we still remain in a pre-paradigmatic stage. We hope that one day we will get to what's called the paradigmatic phase or stage, where we all can agree on a principle, where everyone is in agreement with the basic assumption or premise. We wouldn't have separate schools of thought at that point. It would all coalesce into one sense. Now, according to Thomas Kuhn, that's great, but eventually someone is going to break free from that paradigm, and they're going to challenge that paradigm, and they're going to say, hey, wait a minute, this theory or this mindset, the concept, it's no longer true. And then what happens is they're going to reject the existing paradigm and force science to find a better explanation. And science goes through these three phases continuously. We refer to this as the wheel of science, right? Where we're constantly purifying, constantly refining ideas for greater clarity. And there's the truth, the objective truth is never answered. It's what the prevailing belief set is at a given point. Now, I can give you an example before I go into the schools of thought and how we're going to cover the book. But how many of you have heard the term microaggression? Anyone ever hear that term? And willing to give me a working definition? So, Gabrielle, you heard the term. Are you actually, you know what? Let me call on someone different. Laura, can you give me a working definition of the concept of microaggression?
I don't know if it'll be necessarily completely accurate, but I can try.
Do the best you can and we'll fill in the gaps.
Microaggression is a an action that is as a result of bias, but it's not something that's entirely aggressive. It's like small things within that's like aimed at minority groups.
Mhm.
So it's not like if we're talking about racism, it's not like what would be viewed in society as like blatant racism. It would be viewed as like small digs at people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's a pretty good. You added a lot of important concepts. That's really good. Thank you. Gerald Wing Sue defines microaggressions as the everyday slights and denigrations, attacks on a group and its people that are more oftentimes unconscious, right? So these are the unconscious everyday slights we do to a person or a group of people. So if we were to go, oh yeah. I'm familiar with South Park, but if we were to go during the holiday season, the winter holidays, and wish someone Merry Christmas, anything wrong with that? At face value, you would say, no, there's nothing wrong with it. But on a more subtle level, what if you don't celebrate Christmas? What if you are Jewish or Muslim? Or what if you're an atheist and a person's wishing you Merry Christmas? Now, more often than not, and this is why I like what you said, it's not intentional. Most microaggressions happen and occur based on really well-intentioned good people. People don't, most people aren't blatantly racist. But when you say Merry Christmas to someone who doesn't celebrate Christmas, the implication is this holiday is more valid than yours. Or the implication could be, well, you don't celebrate it, but maybe you should celebrate it. And that's on a more subtle level. So a person might feel excluded or alienated by something that is well-intentioned. So in the microaggression research, Gerald Wing Sue, Kevin Nadal, and many others, we kind of talk about the impact of the action, not the motivation for the action. Now, as Sue said, most microaggressions are by well-intentioned people. It's usually an unconscious bias, but there are something called micro assaults, which are blatantly racist. Instead of it being more subtle, it could be outwardly aggressive, but most are more subtle and unconscious. Now, I bring that up because I've presented the concept of microaggression. I've presented the manifestation of microaggressions. But what if I told you that this concept is a debated concept in psychology? Now, I happen to be a proponent of the theory of microaggressions. I've seen it, I've experienced it, I know what one looks like. But that doesn't mean that it's universally accepted. There are people like Scott Lilienfeld. If you look at the debate that happened between Gerald Wing Sue and Scott Lilienfeld in 2017, they had a whole journal issue dedicated to this concept. And, they wrote articles back and forth rebutting each other's point of view. And the biggest criticism of microaggressions and microaggression research from Scott Lilienfeld is it's an open concept. We haven't pinned down 100% what we're looking at. We haven't come to an agreed upon, way to measure it, because the vast majority of microaggression research is phenomenological research, which is based on the subjective experience of the person. So if we cannot objectively measure it, we're not at a point to entirely embrace it. And that's the basic premise of Scott Lilienfeld. So who's right? Right? So I have my own leaning towards Gerald Wing Sue, but it's important to understand that there's not uniform agreement. And there are many psychological concepts like that. There are tons of them. So I bring that up again just as a reminder because we talked about the pre-paradigmatic stage where we're not in agreement. There are people who adopted Sue and colleagues' principles, and there are people who attempt to reject Sue and colleagues' principles. All right, so we're now in the home stretch of the lesson. I may actually be finishing earlier than I thought. So bringing back the question, if we finish earlier, we finish earlier. Now, let me give you a roadmap for what we're going to do throughout the semester. The first test is basically foundational building blocks. And the first test, we're going to look at chapters 1, 2, and 3. So you've now experienced chapter 1, but chapter 2 refers to the philosophical antecedents to experimental psychology. Antecedents mean the things that were happening before psychology was founded. So there were philosophers that talked about very similar ideas that we talk about today, right? And I think I talked to you about the paradox of psychology. It's the oldest and newest discipline at the same time, right? So how's it the oldest? Well, chapter 2, we're going to learn all about the different philosophers and their points of view and what they contributed to things like cognition and memory and understanding of what the mind is. But philosophy is largely speculative. And that happened to be occurring while, I guess, psychology is starting to develop. So the philosophical antecedents is chapter 2. Then chapter 3, the physiological antecedents. Now, one of the really cool things that make psychology like everything else is that it is a natural science. It subscribes to the same research strategies as every other science. So we had people studying the brain, studying sensation and perception, studying subjective experience of vision before we had our current discipline of psychology the way we do. Now, the physiological antecedents are really beneficial to modern neuroscience, modern cognitive psychology, things like that. After test 1, we will start to talk about really the beginnings of psychology. And we're going to talk about structuralism and functionalism. So structuralism dealt with our conscious experience. Now, structuralism in principle, we're trying to understand the building blocks of consciousness. So Wundt wanted to put all the building blocks together to build up a conscious experience, whereas Titchener, which was Wundt's primary student, we'll talk about in chapter 5, he wanted to treat psychology like chemistry. And just like we have a periodic table of elements, he wanted to break things down to their elementary stage in terms of consciousness. So he was looking for mental elements. So whether we're building up consciousness or breaking it down to its more elemental parts, they're both structuralistic points of view. Now, you don't have a class on structuralism as a psychology major. And the reason for that is structuralism served its purpose and it died out. So from a evolution of the science point of view, it no longer was adaptive. It no longer helped the science continue to grow. Well, along comes functionalism. And so instead of just understanding the building blocks of the mind. We're trying to think about things in terms of a more pragmatic sense. Remember the word pragmatism. William James is going to come up. It's all about adapting to the environment. And with the functionalistic spirit, you'll start to learn all about our testing movement. You'll learn about all of those really cool applied psychology subdisciplines. That'll be test number 2. Then we're going to do a deeper dive on behaviorism. Now, behaviorism, while it's one paradigm, or it's one school of thought, I should say, not every behaviorist agrees to the same principles. Some behaviorists are what we refer to as radical behaviorists. And they're not radical in the sense that they're extremists. That's not what the word radical means in this sense. It just means that they only focus on behavior and leave no space for cognition. Versus the methodological behaviorists, they tend to embrace more cognitive processes. And there was a debate. So you had, the Watsons and the Pavlovs and the Skinners of the world, who are all considered radical behaviorists, arguing against more of the cognitive behavioral point of view. Now, today, we've all but eliminated that radical behaviorist point of view because cognitive psychology blossomed and demonstrated cognition is real. So that's the behaviorist point of view. We'll learn all about the historical wave. Now, what's interesting is that I'm gonna teach you about behaviorism prior to teaching you about psychoanalysis. And I think that's interesting because behaviorism was responding or was a reaction to psychoanalysis. But because your book puts behaviorism first, I cover that first. But we will learn about Gestalt points of view. We'll learn about psychoanalysis, humanistic, and cognitive. So that should bring us all the way to the end of the semester. So Gestalt, psychoanalysis, humanistic, and cognitive are on the final. Now, the reality is sometimes I don't get all the way to cognitive. Sometimes I wind up by the end of the semester at humanistic psychology, and that's where we end. So if we don't get to the final lecture, we don't get to the final lecture, and it's okay with me. And it'll just be less on your final. But when we talk about Gestalt, you might remember the figure ground exercises, or you might have remembered the picture. Is it 2 faces or is it an hourglass? You might remember things like that. That's all Gestalt. So the word Gestalt means pattern or configuration. So when we talk about sensory or perceptual experiences, that's what Gestalt talks about. And then psychoanalysis, really, psychoanalysis's biggest gift is in our understanding of personality and psychotherapy. Now, we will talk about Freud's version of psychoanalysis, but I think it's also important to talk about even Freud's followers disagreed with him on several points. So you will oftentimes see that people don't get behind Freud when he talks about things like sex. So his psychosexual stages are debated. His dream analysis is pretty debated about whether there are phallic symbols and things like that. There are people who still believe in his approach, but then there are other people who said, he was overly sexual. So they desexualized his theory and normalized his theory. So things like attachment theory, which is pretty widely accepted, actually comes out of the psychoanalytic school of thought. People who talk about lifespan development, Erik Erikson, that comes or originates as a reaction to Freud's theory. Our understanding of talk therapy, the foundations of talk therapy, come from Freud. right? So there's a lot that he contributed that was good as well. And I'm not Freud's biggest fan as a cognitive behavioral therapist, but I still dabble in some of his ideas that I find useful. So I'm not going to say everything he said was horrible. And if you have a professor do that, you should push back the same way and just ask, so nothing Freud said has any validity? And you'll start to see them backpedal. And then we'll talk about third force psychology. When we say third force, that implies that there are two major forces before it, and that's humanistic psychology is our third force. What was the first force? Psychoanalysis. What's the second force? Behaviorism. What's the third force? Humanistic psychology. And humanistic psychology really, they realized that the behaviorists and the psychoanalysts, they were overly deterministic. And the word determinism basically means everything is preordained. There's no free will. And if there's no free will, there's no potential for true growth. And the humanistic and existential psychologists said that's not true. They also did not like that psychoanalysis focuses on neurosis and pathology. Humanistic and existential psychology focuses on growth and reaching your potential, such as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What's at the top of the needs chart? Self-actualization. Self-actualization is when you're in a transcendent state of your deficiencies and you've reached your potential. So that's not pathology. That's not neurosis. That's not fixations like Freud was saying. So long story short, the modern application of humanistic psychology is positive psychology. We're focusing on strengths of people, focusing on a person's ability to grow and reach their potential. Revolutionary in its time. And then last but not least, cognitive psychology. I said that cognitive psychology came about and pushed back against the behaviorists. So in the 1960s, roughly, you might hear it referred to as a cognitive revolution, where there was enough data to show mental processes occur and they impact the relationship between one's environment and their behavior. One good example is, I want you to imagine that you're walking down the street and someone sucker punches you. Note your level of pain. And then compare that against if you're a soldier and you get shot and your level of pain in the moment. Believe it or not, people will report greater pain when it was unexpected versus when they have a bunch of adrenaline occurring and it's a likely outcome. So in the moment, people report more pain, believe it or not, when they're sucker punched than even if getting shot. How could it be? One is a far greater pain, but your perception of the pain is far lower. The mind, cognition, how we process the information matters too. So, and then we'll talk about where is psychology going? Like the modern age, 1990s was referred to as the age of the brain. And today, looking at comparative psychology and cognitive neuroscience, these are the directions that psychology is likely going to try and synthesize everything. So evolutionary psychology basically tries to understand how our psychological processes are connected to survival. And the assumption is that all of our behaviors are somehow connected to adaptation or survival. Even if it's a maladaptive process, it's meant to help you cope. So things like denial, it's suppression of pain, but it's adaptive. So evolutionary psychology puts everything in the prism of we're wired to promote survival, and everything we do is look through that prism. And then cognitive neuroscience tries to truly connect the brain to everything that I've said earlier today. Now, let's see how much you remember. Can anyone give me, and please let's use the raise hand tool. And I'm going to take the slideshow off, stop share. Can anyone give me a definition of historiography? What is historiography? It's going to show up on your test, right? So it's a way of, oh, Gabrielle.
Historiography, it's like the two disciplines between the history of and psychology, and it refers to different principles like methods and the how it came from like philology issues and historical research.
Yeah, so historiography is basically how we study psychology's history. So we're tracking and studying the historical context of how psychology evolved. So that's what historiography is, right? So it's a hybrid between history and psychology, trying to understand how it emerged. Okay. Zeitgeist. Can anyone give me a definition of that? Zeitgeist. Jenna.
It's the cultural spirit of whichever time.
Yeah, so it's whatever is happening in that time period. It is the political realm, what are the political attitudes? It's the social context of where things are happening, which is more of the Ortgeist. But yeah, so it's everything that's happening that might drive one's mindset or perspective at that time period. Personalistic theory. Anyone want to take that one? Laura.
It's the idea that without great people, we wouldn't have great ideas.
Okay, so these major groundbreaking ideas come from a specific person, and we needed that person to make that happen. Versus a naturalistic theory.
It's this concept of the time. So without that time, it wouldn't be possible for these ideas or people to be accepted at that time.
Yeah, no matter how great the person, if they're not considered aligned with the mindset of that time period, it's not going to be received. So I asked you to think about Darwin's theory of evolution, bringing his idea back to the 1500s and seeing him trying to push that idea then. A naturalistic point of view would say society wasn't ready for it. Whereas in the 1800s, society was more willing to embrace it. Therefore, Freud's ideas were more palatable. The Chiron Society. That is basically the scientific society of the day, where people would present their ideas. Anyone watch, I guess it was the Jungle Cruise? Remember that movie that just came out recently with The Rock? At the beginning of the movie, there was that person presenting their ideas in an auditorium with a bunch of other people, and it was a stuffy environment, but they were presenting their ideas. The Chiron Society was like that, where the scholars of the day would go and they would present their ideas. A paradigm. What is a paradigm, Amber? Amber Alinsky. What's a paradigm? Chastity Chung. What's a paradigm?
Is it when one accepted viewpoint is held to explain science?
Yeah, when there's a universally agreed upon point of view versus the pre-paradigmatic stage. Gia, what's the pre-paradigmatic stage? Gia Esposito. You know, this tells me that people are muting themselves without the camera on and they're walking away. That's really what this tells me. Chloe, go for it.
It's the stage of a science which is divided into schools of thought, and that's currently where we're at.
That's currently where science is. They're competing schools of thought, no universally accepted point of view. All right, so Jess, what is the revolutionary stage? Jess. All right, Sarah Nassimi. What is the revolutionary stage? Sarah?
Yes. Sorry, I don't remember.
Okay.
I did not get my book yet either. Sorry.
No problem. Taylor?
I don't know if it's right. Like the recovery stage. You know.
I wouldn't say recovery stage. Teresa, do you want to try and take that one?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
When a paradigm is no longer accepted.
Yeah, when a paradigm is no longer accepted, so that universal agreement is broken away from, and it forces science to refine itself.
Oh.
Taylor, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I wasn't muted. I was just saying, oh, because I was listening. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. Jonathan, what is a school of thought?
Is a school of thought when everyone is collectively thinking the same thing?
Well, I wouldn't say everyone. If you say everyone, you're talking about more of a paradigm stage. A school of thought is a group of people that have a shared mindset or understanding, but it isn't a universal paradigm. So you can have competing schools of thought. And I gave the example of Skinner versus Chomsky on language development, right? So a school of thought is a group of people who have agreed on a set of principles. Doesn't mean it's universally accepted. So the behaviorist versus the psychoanalyst and so forth. All right. Who wants to answer? How can psychology claim that it's both the oldest and newest of all sciences? I'll take hands raised. Anyone who wants to take it. All right, Jenny.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? So I guess it's because psychology is a science, so that's why it's like
We lost you.
Idea. However, it's like however it's used as, but its usage is more modern. Like it's more current.
So
yeah.
No problem. Victoria, do you want to add to that?
Sure. Is it how it's considered old and new since it's sort of always evolving? There's always things you could add on to a theory or a concept or an idea to get more definitive information.
Let me ask it differently, right? Because these questions are thought-provoking questions from the book. Where are psychology's origins, Gabrielle?
Well, the origins is in philosophy and those deep discussions, which make it old because you used to have philosophers grappling with ideas loosely, but not able to really apply or test it. And it's new because we have changed it over the years. It's gained formality in a sense. We have tests, we have ways to prove it. We have data collected now rather than just in-depth conversation and hypothesis.
Exactly. So the oldest discipline, because it's deeply rooted in philosophy, which I went back to ancient Greece, but really it goes even before that. It's just there's a lot of traditions that are not promoted to the same. But the newest is as a psychological science, that's 1879, right? So how does data from history differ from data from science? Aspa.
I would say, I don't know if this is right, but I would say because like historical data are majority of them when they're found, they're like incomplete.
Good job. Yeah, they're oftentimes fragmented, incomplete, and sometimes, as the next question is, distorted, right? Sometimes it's intentionally distorted for an agenda purpose or biographical purpose. But yeah, history is oftentimes incomplete and fragmented. Good job. How did discrimination play a role in the development of psychology? Elizabeth LaFaro.
I'm not really sure.
Can you give me one group of people that were discriminated against?
I don't know.
Professor, can I
Yeah,
answer this one?
go for it. Yeah.
The groups of people, there were Jewish professors weren't allowed to teach in colleges, and some of them were first forced to change their names to further their careers. Also, Black people, they were heavily discriminated against when they tried to get into academia.
Yep. And women, right? So I think I'm looking at all the other questions, and I think that we kind of covered it all. So I don't need to go through any of the additional review questions because we did it as definitions. But it's 6:14. Anyone have any additional questions before I go back into the attendance roster?
Professor, I have a question. So at the end of each lecture, do you usually do this like with the review? Because it was very helpful.
At the end of each slideshow, not every lecture, like because I didn't do it at the end of the first one because it was halfway through. So,
Finished. Okay.
But yeah, for history of psychology, it's something I've adopted because I feel like it helped.
It was very helpful. Thank you.
You spent 4 hours listening to me, and now the review will help you understand the definitions and the major points. So yeah, I try to do that.
Okay, thank you.
And you're welcome. And people will tell you I don't do that for all of my classes, right? But this class is one that redundancy is a good thing. Any other questions? Gabrielle.
So I wasn't here the first class because of the overtally issue. What do we have homework? Is that like a thing?
Not a thing in this class. It is a thing objectively, but not for my class.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because I was so worried I was going to be late with the first assignment. I was looking all over Blackboard. I was like, I see last ones. I see no homework.
Well, the syllabus, you have 4 exams, of which I take your top 3 as 90% of your grade, and your participation, which I think it's pretty clear that you've been spontaneously volunteering, is the other 10%. So you're going to be good.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Professor.
You got it. Hunter?
Hi, Professor. Is it all right if I speak to you for a minute when class ends?
Indeed, yes.
Thank you.
Let me take attendance one more time, and then what I'll do is I'll enable the waiting room, and anyone who wants to talk to me after class can.
Thank you.
You got it.